Out in the scorching plains of the old frontier, where dust carried secrets and silence told stories, not every legend wore a badge or held a rifle. Some walked barefoot, unnoticed, burdened by mockery and spit rather than praise or medals. His name was whispered only in insult. The stable boy, the native, the nobody, who swept manure while others saddled their glory. They laughed at him, daily, mercilessly, because in a land ruled by guns and gold, no one saw dignity in a broom or pride in a man without boots. But the West always had a strange way of revealing its truths. Just when you think you know a man, the desert winds shift, and the story you thought was background becomes the tale everyone needs to hear. That morning, when a foreign general rode in with his polished uniform and thundering entourage, the entire outpost stood to attention. Yet what he did next silenced every sneer, froze every finger that once pointed in ridicule. He dismounted, stepped through the dust, and saluted, not a soldier, not a sheriff, but the man they all laughed at. You see, legends in the Wild West weren't always made in duels or shootouts. Some were forged quietly, in scars that didn't show, in battles fought with silence and humility. This wasn't just a story about justice. It was about legacy, the kind that outlives horses, uniforms, and even death. The kind of legacy that only a few understand, and fewer still live to witness unfold. The people at that fort had no idea who the native truly was, where he'd been, what he'd sacrificed, or what that salute truly meant. But they were about to learn, and you're about to discover a part of the West that history books often skip, because it doesn't fit neatly into tales of cowboys and bandits. It fits deeper, into the soul of the forgotten. Stay close now, because once this story starts, you won't want to blink. One man's silence was worth more than 100 loud guns. And when you understand why, you'll never look at anyone the same again. The town of Dry Creek wasn't much more than dust and stubborn pride. It sat under the sun like a forgotten relic, where men walked wide-legged from too many saddle hours, and kids learned to shoot before they could write their names. In this place, respect was measured in scars and your worth counted by how fast you could draw. That's why when Takota arrived, silent, reserved, and dark-skinned, the townsfolk looked at him as if he didn't belong. He was native, they said, and that was enough to put him beneath them in their eyes. A man without a past, they figured, or at least one not worth mentioning. Takota never spoke much. He kept to the stables behind the saloon, tending horses as if they were royalty. His hands were worn, calloused not just from labor, but from the cold judgment of men who had never known war nor loss. They laughed when he brushed down the colonel's mare with more tenderness than most fathers gave their sons. They mocked him when he refused whiskey or cards at the bar. And when a fight broke out, Takota would simply vanish into the shadows, not out of fear, but choice. That's what they never understood. Children were told not to be like him. Too quiet, too weak, they said. But what they didn't know was that in Takota's silence, there was thunder. Inside him lived stories older than the railroad, older than the border lines they fought to protect. He had once been a warrior, not in their wars, but in the wars they tried to erase. The land knew him, whispered to him in the morning winds, and sang to him through the hoofbeats of the horses he cared for. What he lacked in gold, he made up for in honor. He fixed every saddle without ever charging extra. He led lost colts back to their mothers when other men would have shot them for sport. But none of this mattered to the townsfolk. In Dry Creek, your value had to be loud. Loud with guns, loud with stories, loud with lies. Takota was quiet, and so they laughed. Then came the day the telegram arrived. Brittle paper that sent a tremor through the saloon. A general was riding in, an old war dog who'd seen blood and victory. The town readied itself like a bride on her wedding morning. Flags were raised, guns were cleaned, and Takota, he still swept the stables, as if nothing had changed. The general's arrival stirred the dust long before his boots touched ground. His company stretched the length of the canyon road, a thunderous march of metal and men. Dry Creek's folk lined the street, tipping their hats and puffing their chests, eager for a nod or even a glance. This wasn't just any visitor. This was General Whitmore, hero of the Southern campaigns, a man whose name carried more weight than bullets. When the general finally halted, the town fell into silence. The air stood still, hot and thick with expectation. He dismounted without fanfare, his boots landing hard on the dry earth. But instead of walking toward the mayor or the waiting sheriff, he turned, slowly, deliberately, and began striding through the crowd. People stepped back, confused. Whispers rose. No one understood, until they saw who he was walking toward. Tuckoda stood by the stable gate, dust on his sleeves, a horseshoe in one hand. He hadn't moved. He hadn't expected anything. That's when the general stopped before him, removed his hat, and in front of every man, woman, and child, offered a crisp, respectful salute. Not out of charity, not out of guilt, but from deep, undeniable reverence. And the town gasped, not because of what was happening, but because they couldn't believe why it was happening. "You still smell like war, old friend," the general said, his voice cracking like leather. "But I never forgot what you did." Tuckoda said nothing. His eyes locked on the man before him, and in that silence, 100 stories were exchanged. Some of the younger men stared in disbelief. The older ones, veterans themselves, suddenly stood a little straighter, their eyes narrowing as old memories clawed back into view. What followed was not an explanation. Not yet, but attention, like the hush before a storm. For the first time, Dry Creek began to wonder who this man really was. The stable boy they'd mocked, the native they'd ignored. He wasn't just someone. He was something far greater than they could have imagined, and they were about to learn why. The saloon, once buzzing with laughter and arrogance, now echoed with stunned silence. The general's salute hadn't just honored Tuckoda. It had shattered years of ignorance in a single, deliberate gesture. Men who once scoffed at him now struggled to meet his eyes. Women, who had taught their sons to avoid him, looked on as if seeing a ghost from a war they never knew happened. The general stepped closer and placed a weathered hand on Tuckoda's shoulder, a gesture of brotherhood, of shared bloodshed, of memories buried too long beneath the dust. "You saved us all that night in Black Rock Pass," the general said, loud enough for every soul in Dry Creek to hear. His words cut the air like a blade. "Your plan, your courage, it wasn't in any report. But I lived because of it. So did 84 men." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Black Rock Pass was a legend, a suicidal standoff where an entire battalion was presumed lost, only for a few bloodied survivors to stumble back weeks later. No one knew what had happened. Until now. Tuckoda didn't blink. He didn't seek their approval. He hadn't lived for their applause. His silence was a kind of dignity few in Dry Creek could comprehend. That's why the truth hit them harder than any bullet. The man they had mocked as less than nothing was the unseen hand that had shaped the very legends they toasted in their bars. He had stood in the gap when others ran. He had bled for a country that still spat at his name. And still, he had returned. Not to glory, not to vengeance, but to tend the hooves of the same cavalry that had once left him behind. That kind of grace made the townspeople shift uncomfortably in their boots. They were used to forgiveness coming in the form of prayers, not quiet resilience. They were used to heroes boasting in saloons, not shoveling manure behind barns. The general turned to the crowd. "You don't know the man standing before you," he said, "but you owe him more than you'll ever know." Then, without another word, he mounted his horse and rode off, his men following like shadows swallowed by the canyon. And Dry Creek was left to face itself, to reckon with the man they had buried beneath their laughter, only to find him standing taller than any of them ever had. It was after the general's departure that the town truly changed. Not immediately, not loudly, but in the small, uncomfortable silences that followed whenever Tuckoda passed. People stepped aside now, unsure of what to say. The children stared longer. The fathers corrected them less. No one quite knew how to treat a man they had scorned for years, only to discover he had once led soldiers through hell and returned with nothing but silence and scars. The sheriff, a proud man with a silver badge and a long memory, was one of the first to break. He visited the stables late one evening, hat in hand, eyes lowered like a boy sent to apologize. "I didn't know," he muttered, voice dry as sand. Tuckoda said nothing. He didn't need to. Forgiveness, to him, wasn't a matter of words. It was an action, in peace, in simply continuing to do right even when the world did wrong. What struck the people most wasn't the tale itself, but how little Takota seemed to care for retelling it. He never corrected their lies. He never sought their praise. His presence began to haunt them, not as a ghost, but as a mirror, a reflection of all they had overlooked, of all the greatness they had trampled in their thirst for flash and noise. And slowly, shame began to soften the town's edges. Old soldiers who had never spoken much began to sit near Takota in the shade. One by one, they opened their mouths, offering pieces of their own stories, confessions, regrets, and truths they'd never dared say out loud. And Takota listened. That was his gift. Not just his silence, but his ability to carry the weight of other men's pain without judgment. He was a stable hand by trade, but in truth, he had always been tending something far greater than horses. He had been tending broken spirits. In time, Dry Creek began to realize something rare and holy had lived among them all along. A man whose greatness wasn't carved into medals, but etched quietly into the choices he made every day. The stable boy they'd laughed at had never needed their recognition. But now that they saw him, truly saw him, they could no longer look away. It was the town's oldest settler, Widow Jenkins, who first broke the silence in public. At Sunday service, as the preacher spoke of humility and hidden strength, she stood and cleared her throat. "I reckon," she said, voice trembling but firm, "we've all seen what that looks like in flesh and blood." Every head turned. Her eyes met Takota's at the back of the chapel, standing alone as always, hands folded like a man who carried more than just his own burdens. "And I say it's time we stopped pretending we didn't." From that moment on, a shift began, not just in words but in action. The townsfolk started asking Takota for advice on horses, yes, but also on matters of heart and home. Not because they pitied him, but because they trusted him. There was something in his way of standing still that made even the most restless men feel anchored. It was the kind of strength no badge could grant, no title could imitate. He had nothing to prove because he had already proved it when no one was watching. Boys who once mocked him now listened as he taught them how to earn a horse's trust, not break its will. Fathers brought their sons to the stables, not for chores, but for lessons in patience. And the stables themselves, once seen as the lowest place in Dry Creek, became something sacred. Not because the smell changed, but because people now understood who stood inside it. They realized greatness didn't always wear boots polished to a shine. Sometimes it walked barefoot in silence. But Takota never let their attention swell his pride. When the mayor offered to build him a new house near the courthouse, he refused. "I sleep best near hooves," he said with a faint smile. It wasn't defiance. It was peace. He wasn't seeking elevation. He only wanted honesty, from the land, from the animals, and now, finally, from the people who had once scorned him. His reward wasn't recognition, but restoration, the quiet healing of a long-wounded dignity. And so Dry Creek began to relearn what made a man worthy. Not how fast he could draw, nor how many men feared him, but how many he uplifted simply by being. Takota had walked among them like a ghost, invisible by choice, unrecognized by ignorance. But now they saw him, not as the stable boy, but as the man who held their entire story together without ever saying a word. There was one man, though, who couldn't let go of the past so easily. Jeb Cartwright, the blacksmith's son. Proud, fiery, and raised on stories of conquest, he had been among Takota's loudest taunters. Even after the general salute, Jeb kept his distance, bitter and defensive. "I don't care who he was," he snapped one evening. "He ain't one of us." But his voice trembled. It wasn't hate anymore. It was fear. The fear of being wrong for too long, of having built pride on a lie. That summer, Jeb's prize stallion fell ill, a fever no one in town could break. He tried everything. Doctors, traveling traders, even a preacher's blessing. Nothing worked. Desperate, he did the one thing his father never taught him. He asked for help with humility. Takota came silently, carrying only herbs, cool cloth, and calm hands. He stayed the entire night, whispering to the horse, tending it like family. By morning, the stallion stood. Jeb didn't speak. He just cried, not just for his horse, but for every year he had chosen blindness over truth. After that, even the hardest heart softened. Because Takoda didn't just help people. He healed them. Quietly. Relentlessly. Without condition. And that kind of power, people began to realize, was far greater than a pistol or a title. It came from a place most men couldn't reach, because they were too loud, too proud, too scared to listen. Takoda listened. The legends of Dry Creek began to shift. The stories told around fires were no longer just about outlaws and duels, but about a man who once cleaned stables while carrying the weight of a forgotten war on his back. Children now played pretending to be him, not just cowboys. They mimicked his quiet strength, his calm, his stillness. Parents didn't stop them. In fact, they encouraged it. And though Takoda never stood behind a pulpit or ran for office, his name became sacred in the town's heart. Not out of guilt, not out of pity, but out of awe. For decades they had missed the treasure standing in their midst, brushing hooves and feeding animals while they chased shadows of heroism. And now, with eyes finally opened, they saw what had always been true. Some of the greatest men in the West didn't need a shout. They just needed to be seen. Seasons passed, and the winds of Dry Creek carried new dust, new faces, and new stories. But Takoda remained, unwavering, a living monument not to war, but to wisdom. He grew older, slower perhaps, yet more present than ever. He never asked for a statue, though the townsfolk whispered about building one. He's already carved into this place. The preacher once said, not in stone, but in how we treat each other now. And it was true. Men thought twice before mocking silence. Children looked twice before judging a man by the dirt on his hands. Every stranger who came to town would hear his name within the first hour. You want your horse treated right? Find Takoda. But when they'd meet him, humble, calm, not interested in small talk, they'd always expect something more dramatic. Some grand tale. Takoda never offered one. He only offered help. He'd patch saddles, bandage wounds, or simply sit beside those who didn't know they needed company. And eventually, the silence between him and others began to speak volumes. The saloon, once a place of ridicule, became a place of reverence. Not for whiskey or bravado, but for shared stories. And often, those stories began with the words, "I didn't know who he was until..." That sentence echoed from lips across generations. It became a confession, a lesson, a mark of humility. Even the sheriff had it stitched into the lining of his new coat, gifted to him by the townsfolk. Respect the quiet ones. One winter, a drifter wandered into town, ragged, coughing blood, eyes wild with war and loss. The people turned their backs, fearful of sickness, of trouble. But Takoda didn't. He took the man into the stables, gave him warmth, food, and silence. Days later, the drifter left, healthier, clearer. He left a note behind. "You didn't ask what I'd done. You only reminded me I could still be more than it." That note was nailed to the stable wall, where it remains to this day. Takoda's power wasn't in what he'd done long ago. It was in what he continued to do every single day. No audience, no reward, just quiet mercy. And that, the town came to realize, was the most dangerous kind of strength, the kind that didn't need to be seen to shape everything around it. In time, Takoda became more than just a figure in Dry Creek. He became its heartbeat. The land itself seemed to respond to him. Horses calmed in his presence. Trees leaned toward the stables. Storms softened around his roof. The town began to believe, in whispers and wonder, that perhaps the land honored him more than the people ever could. And in the wild terrain of the West, that meant something deep, something spiritual. Even newcomers felt it. A senator once passed through Dry Creek during a campaign tour. He shook hands, kissed babies, promised railroads and riches. But when he reached the stables and offered his hand to Takoda, the native simply nodded. He didn't care for titles or charm. The senator, clearly unsettled, left without fanfare. Man like that, the senator later told his aide, he sees through everything. Makes you question what you're really worth. That's what Takoda did. Not with force, not with words, but with presence. He had become a measure of integrity. If you couldn't look him in the eyes, something in you wasn't right. The mayor once said, half joking, "Forget judges. Just sit with Takoda for 10 minutes. He'll tell you who you really are, without saying a word." It became a saying. Face the stable mirror. they'd say in Dry Creek. Because that's what he was now, a mirror to every soul that passed through. But with time came age. And with age, the body grew heavy. Tuckota no longer rose before dawn, but close to it. He still fed the horses, still swept the stalls, but the fire in his stride had softened to an ember. The town watched carefully, afraid of the day he'd stop moving altogether. They didn't know how to say it, how to prepare for a world without his quiet presence holding it together. And yet, Tuckota smiled more in those years than ever before, because he had already done what few ever do. He had lived not to be remembered, but to remember others. And in doing so, he had shaped not just a town, but a way of life. One where silence held power, where humility stood taller than guns, where the heart of a man mattered more than the hat he wore. One crisp autumn morning, Tuckota didn't come to the stables. The horses neighed restlessly. The barn doors, always open by sunrise, remained shut. It was the young boy Thomas, the orphan Tuckota had taken in after a flood years ago, who went to check. Inside the small wooden cabin behind the barn, he found Tuckota seated in his chair, hands resting gently on his knees, eyes closed as if listening to a distant wind. There was no struggle, no pain, only peace, the kind that comes when a man knows he has finished what he came to do. The news spread slowly, as if the town couldn't bear to carry it all at once. The bell at the chapel rang once, a single, echoing note. No one spoke for hours. The silence blanketed Dry Creek thicker than any snow ever had. Some cried, others just stood still. But all of them, young and old, rich and poor, drunkard and preacher, made their way to the stables one by one. They didn't bring flowers. They brought memories, deeds, pieces of rope he'd braided, saddles he'd mended, stories he'd shaped without saying a word. They held no grand funeral, because Tuckota would have hated that. Instead, they did what he always did, they listened. For an entire day, Dry Creek was still. Men leaned on fences. Women held their children close. And the wind that passed through the town that afternoon carried something sacred. Not sorrow, but gratitude. It wasn't the end of a legend. It was the return of a man to the earth he had never left. That night, under a sky so clear it felt carved in glass, the people of Dry Creek lit lanterns outside the stable. Not to mourn, but to guide, as if Tuckota's spirit still wandered, checking hooves, calming storms, reminding the living to walk softer. And then Thomas, his eyes red but voice steady, climbed onto the same stool Tuckota once used to teach him how to tend a wound. He wasn't just a hero, the boy said. He was the reason we remembered how to be human. No one argued. They didn't need to, because deep down, every soul in Dry Creek knew Tuckota had never truly left. He had simply become part of everything. The wind, the soil, the stillness between words. The boy who cleaned the stables had become the man who cleaned their hearts. And now, they would carry him forward, not in monuments, but in every quiet act of grace. Years later, travelers would pass through Dry Creek and hear whispers of a legend that didn't sound like the others. Not a gunslinger, not a sheriff, not a bandit, just a man who cleaned stables and changed the world around him without lifting a weapon. Some would laugh at first. That's it, they'd say. But the longer they stayed, the more they noticed. The way people greeted each other, the way children listened instead of shouted, the way silence was no longer feared, but honored. There was a sign carved into the old stable gate now, weathered and simple. The strongest man in town was the quietest. And beneath it, a worn wooden bench where strangers often found themselves sitting longer than they intended. Something about the air there calmed the soul. The horses were quieter, the wind gentler. People said they dreamed better when they slept nearby. No one could explain it. No one tried. It was just the way things were, ever since Tuckota. The new generation grew up knowing his story not as legend, but as instruction. Schools taught about the war he saved, yes, but more often, they taught the stories behind the story. How he never raised his voice. How he lifted others without lifting himself. How he taught forgiveness not with sermons, but with stillness. He was proof that in a land of noise, a whisper could still lead. And maybe that was what made his story so powerful. It wasn't about what happened once, but what kept happening because of him. His legacy wasn't locked in the past. It was alive, breathing through every act of kindness in Dry Creek. Every hand offered without condition. Every silence held with dignity. Tuckoda had become more than memory. He had become the moral compass of a people long driven by pride and gunpowder. In the end, the West had given birth to many tales, most loud, most bloody. But this one, this quiet one, outlived them all. Because in Tuckoda's stillness, the world found something rare. A man who didn't need to win the West to remind it what it meant to be worthy of it. In a land that glorified noise, it was silence that changed everything. Tuckoda never needed to prove himself with fists or fame. His greatness wasn't in what he demanded from others, but in what he gave day after day, without expecting anything in return. His story is not one of sudden triumph, but of steady truth, the kind that reshapes a town, a generation, and maybe even the soul of the West itself. His quiet became the thunder that echoed long after he was gone. And what does that say about the rest of us? About the way we judge those who speak little, dress humbly, or refuse to play the games of pride and power? How many Tuckodas have we ignored, mocked, or passed by, simply because they didn't demand our attention? How often have we mistaken volume for value? In the reflection of his story, we're not just watching a legend, we're confronting our own choices. And perhaps that's what truly makes his life unforgettable. Dry Creek was just a town like any other. But through the life of one man, it learned to listen better, to love deeper, and to lead with humility. That's the power of a life lived with purpose, not loud, but clear, not in grand gestures, but in consistent grace. And as the dust of time continues to settle, what remains are not the gunshots or the glory, but the gentleness that stood unwavering in the face of it all. So as you walk away from this story, carry this with you. Greatness often comes dressed in quiet clothes. And the strongest people you'll ever meet may be the ones who speak the least but change the most. Let Tuckoda's legacy remind us all that honor isn't something we wear. It's something we live, moment by moment, choice by choice, word by word, or sometimes with no words at all. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect in the comments below. Share your thoughts, or simply the name of someone who reminds you of Tuckoda. And if you want to keep discovering more powerful stories like this one, consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like. Your support helps keep these voices alive, even the quiet ones that echo forever.